Protection of PEI Lands, titled Landlines, Discussions about Land Use on Prince Edward Island. The Coalition for the Protection of PEI Lands formed in 2018 in an effort to raise awareness about land issues in PEI, and also to hold government to account on its response to these issues. As an example, multiple governments spanning 50-plus years have promised to enact an island-wide land use plan, and yet have not done so. This indicates the need to examine why this has not happened. This series of podcasts is a result of consultations with our members and those who follow us on social media on what other methods we might try in the Coalition's continuing effort to share information and spark discussion on the issues around land use and abuse on the island, and why governments continue to be unwilling to be transparent about why it continues to happen. Our first episode in this series is called The Point Deroche Development, a Process Undermined. If you enjoyed this episode, please continue the conversation and pass it on. Since colonial times, land ownership and land use on Prince Edward Island have been vulnerable to political interference. This was evident regardless of which party held power at any given time in the island's march into the 21st century. The guiding principles, the supporting legislation, and the mechanisms whereby land use and ownership are administered may have evolved to reflect change in islanders' relationship with the land. However, it is apparent that traditional levers of influence, such as ministerial discretion, have been grandfathered into today's standard operating procedures. The province's Land Planning Authority is currently responsible for 90% of island lands. This means only the remaining 9% is regulated under the stringent template of land use zoning. The province's legislation, regulation, and policies in their current form are the only means by which the vast majority of the island's land is administered. The foundational pieces of legislation that provide the basis for land use and ownership on PEI are the Land Protection Act, the Planning Act, and to some degree, the Environmental Protection Act. Each contains detailed regulations and the authority to assess penalties if these regulations are not complied with. It is through this lens that we are going to discuss a development undertaken recently at 251 Kelpie Lane, Point Deroche. The primary property in question consists of 17.55 acres and includes 200 feet of shore frontage. It is located on the north shore, just west of Savage Harbor. On September 22nd of 2020, an application was made by 251 Kelpie Lane, Inc. to the Island Regulatory and Appeals Commission, IRAC, to purchase this parcel of land. This company is based in Toronto and thus is defined as non-resident. It was registered as an Ontario corporation on the same day as the application was put forward. It is clearly stated in the LPA that seasonal residents cannot own more than 5 acres of land or shore frontage of greater than 165 feet unless they receive permission from the Lieutenant Governor and Council. Just to clarify, the Lieutenant Governor and Council is a provincial cabinet or executive council. What was considered by IRAC on the 2nd of September 2020 in reaching its decision is unknown. Also, recommended acceptance or rejection of this application is not readily available. To provide context to this process, Cabinet in the past has been known to accept or reject applications contrary to what IRAC recommended. Regardless of what information had been gathered, what conditions were applied, or recommendations made, on the 22nd of September 2020, Cabinet reviewed the application from 251 Kelpie Lane, Inc. and ruled it to be exempted from the LPA regulations. There is no accessible record of what documentation accompanied this application, nor what was requested. Further to this, and consistent with 251 Kelpie Lane, Inc.'s application to IRAC 3 weeks earlier, there was no public airing of what terms of reference were applied to reach their decision. Shortly thereafter, Cabinet approved the sale. It chose not to apply any conditions on what the now legal owners were allowed to do with their newly acquired acreage. So, at the end of September 2020, 251 Kelpie Lane was owned by the company of the same name. To state that the decision to allow this transaction and the process through which it was made reflects the Land Protection Act's prudent, balanced, and steadfast stewardship commitment stated in the body of the Act presumes an abundance of public trust in both IRAC and the Executive Council's operating procedures. The process facilitating the massive development soon underway on this shorefront property was aptly described by PEI NDP leader Michelle Neal. Quotes, "The development has become emblematic of the ineffectiveness of policies and legislation designed to protect the environment when they are poorly enforced, ignored, or overridden by authorities with the power to do so. By the summer of 2022, site work at 251 Kelpie Lane was well underway. The pre-existing structure had been demolished and moved off-site. Thousands of tons of granite had been trucked in to create a massive breakwater extending at least 60 feet from the natural bank. Footings were being poured for the 5 interconnected buildings. This was the first time that the public became aware of this development. This was due to the actions of former president of Island Trails, Inc. and founder of the Island Walk, Bryson Guptill. An avid hiker, Bryson was shocked by the scope and footprint of the newly created breakwater on Point Deroche, as his path was blocked in a section of beach he often walked. Bryson took photographs and made them publicly available. The public response was immediate and extensive. Bryson has been diligent in investigating this development and uncovering details of the process which allowed it to continue. He has clearly presented his findings to the island and beyond. We welcome Bryson here today to reflect on this development and the repercussions it generated." That must have been a shock on that day in the summer of 22 when you first encountered the thousands of tons of rock in Point Deroche.
Yes, indeed. Well, it was a bit of a shock. We had been investigating what was going on at Point Deroche. Of course, we were aware there was something happening there. We had seen the older structure for some time, and Jack McAndrew and Barb McAndrew's house. But then one of the days we went down, the house was gone, and from that point on, our neighbors and we all speculated that maybe they'd just moved the house further back. But we hadn't done a whole lot of investigating until we actually saw the foundation had been set up to pour footings for a new building, and the footings were very, very close to the beach, which was alarming when you saw how close they really were, and certainly not in keeping in any way with the regulations. But let me say that what started off, I think that was on September the 14th, what started off as just some comments on social media turned out to be, it hit a lot of nerves in Prince Edward Island, and before long people were piling on to our social media site, which was just for island walking trails. And for the next year plus, the social media talk was all about Point Deroche. And ultimately, in 2023, it became the news story of the year. So a news story that really could have been avoided quite easily by the developer not trying to bend the rules to their liking. And the rules were quite clear, especially the rules about setbacks and about the buffer zone. And so the initial concerns about it and what people were upset about was it was so close to the beach, it looked like it was not in accordance with the requirements about buffer zones. So the first commentary on CBC and then the follow-up stories that were in The Guardian all related to, is this being built within the buffer zone? And it's surprising because the minister at the time seemed to be caught flat-footed by what his own regulations were. And that was surprising because the Minister of Environment, that was the one that was first appearing as the spokesperson for the government, represented the Environment Department, the environmental regulations, wetlands and watershed regulations. And he spoke to those, but in fact the development permit is not issued by the Minister of Environment. It's issued by the Minister of Planning and Agriculture at that time. And and she was pretty quiet about the whole thing. So, and it was those regulations that actually relate to the development permit, and 75 feet being the required setback amount. And this building was not set back 75 feet. So I recall, even on that first day, sending a note to the Premier, who we used to have pretty constant contact with from a number of other issues that I was involved in. And we expected that the Premier would correct things and get on the file right away. But it became complicated, and it became complicated because of some interpretations that were somewhat bizarre. So let's first of all talk a little bit about how things evolved over the last number of years at Point Deroche. There was a house there. Jack McAndrew and Barb McAndrew lived in that house. They had actually rented it for a couple of years, and then they eventually acquired the property. And when they initially purchased the property, or going back to when they were renting it, there was no issues at Point Deroche. If you look back 40 years ago, 1985, the province has aerial photographs of the area at that time. And if you look at those photographs, you can see the beach just goes right along in front of Point Deroche. So there's no issues at where the cottage was located. And but there was constant erosion, as there is everywhere on Prince Edward Island, but especially dramatic erosion on the North Shore. So in 1985, the aerial photographs that exist on the record evolved, and the new people who bought the house actually took a drone footage of the property back in 2022 at 251 Kelpie Lane, and you can see from those photographs that the house that Barb McAndrew and Jack McAndrew owned, had actually it had eroded all around the house because they had a seawall protecting the house itself. So the creosote seawall was now substantially in front of where the natural bank was. So the natural bank had moved back so that the house was isolated on the beach. If you look at the aerial photographs, and the photographs were actually posted on a website that the developer eventually found himself forced to post all the stories of what happened to the property. But even from Google Maps, the aerial photographs from Google Maps in 2022 showed the McAndrew house being seaward of the natural bank. And I have photographs of those or aerial shots showing the McAndrew property, and one also on the website of the people that had bought the property showed the seawall that was there, and showed the seawall at high tide, where the seawall was in fact so far out on the beach that you can't get around the property, and so they were substantially seaward of the property line. The property line ends at the high tide line, and if you read their deed, it goes to the high tide line. So they were, let's say, 15, maybe 20 feet seaward of the high tide line on the public beach, blocking the public beach, so that at high tide you can't get by the beach at all, and you could only get by the seawall at low tide. We also looked at the development permit that was issued at that time. And the permit was actually issued on September the 22nd, 2021. And so that was about a year before construction started. And as you mentioned, they started to build a rock wall, which started to draw our attention and everyone else's attention. It took them 3 months to build that wall. So it was a substantial amount of work. And from their own website, they showed the excavation behind the seawall, the old seawall. And it goes back further than the natural bank. So the old seawall was actually sticking 60 feet seaward of the top of the natural bank. And that becomes very important because the top of the natural bank is defined as the measuring point for how far back a property has to be set back under both the watercourse and wetlands regulations and the development regulations relating to development permits and subdivisions. So this was a dramatic deviation from the existing regulations, and the government tried to defend it on the basis of a grandfather clause that doesn't exist. We discovered many months later that after our access to information that is a policy in the watercourse and wetlands regulations that kind of is a grandfather clause, but that refers to properties in the buffer zone under the watercourse and wetlands regulations. And the watercourse and wetlands regulations are not the regulations that authorize the development. So it was totally irrelevant in terms of, so it was a real red herring that the minister was putting up at that time, and subsequently didn't withstand any public scrutiny whatsoever. So eventually it was determined that we had to get a legal opinion on this matter. We could not find a PEI law firm. We went to 6 to try to get them to take on the case. No one would touch it because they all felt they had a conflict of interest by doing so much business with the PEI government. So we had to find a Nova Scotia company to actually do the look-see or the examination, give us a legal opinion. And the legal opinion was the development permit was not issued in accordance with the subdivision and development regulations. So, and the aerial photographs that CBC took and various others have taken showed that, especially after Hurricane Fiona, that the property sticks out dramatically beyond the edge of the natural bank. And after Fiona, the aerial photographs taken again by CBC show that the natural bank moved itself back another 20 feet. So now the foundation of the building was actually sticking out, instead of being set back from the top of the bank by 50 feet, it now actually sticks out. And the new building that was constructed there, and the superstructure is up for that building, is substantially now seaward of the natural bank, which means there's no setback whatsoever. Ironically, and I think this is totally bizarre, but not only did they build not in accordance with their development plan, which was approved eventually, but they built they cantilevered the front of the building so that it sticks out another 15 feet seaward of what was then approved, and no one seems to have blinked from that. So, in closing, then, what we've got is a not very nice monument of a superstructure, steel superstructure that hasn't been touched for more than a year, and is overwhelming when it comes to the look of the community and the sea and the beach at Point Deroche.
Thank you, Bryson. Interesting following the trail through the various levels of departments and developers finding reasons to be able to make this process carry on. Now, one key item here that was brought to bear very early in the process but was never really explained involves the establishment of a mean high water mark. To establish the setbacks laid out in the EPA and the Planning Act, a mean high water mark has to be designated. I mean, everything is measured from that point. Do you have any thoughts on who was tasked to do this on Point Deroche and how they arrived at this mark?
Yeah, it's an important point because the deed to the property outlines where the boundary lines are for these properties, all these properties, and the deed, like all the other deeds on the North Shore, shows that the seaward property line is the high water mark. So the deed says the high water mark, but surveyors interpret that as the ordinary high water line, or as you described it, the mean high water line. And it never really gets measured except when someone challenges it. But because of coastal erosion, and this is one of the conclusions of the PEI Climate Lab when they did this study for the minister subsequently, they described that the high water mark keeps moving landward as the erosion takes place. So that high water line 40 years ago was substantially seaward or north of where it is today. And Hurricane Fiona moved it again. So it continues moving inland. And therefore, the regulations have to take that into consideration. And that's why the regulations talk about at least 75 feet from the top of the bank, or 60 feet times the annual rate of erosion, whichever is greater. And in Savage Harbor, the annual rate of erosion is about 3 feet a year. So that's the measuring point. That would mean that in the case of Pointe Deroche, that the new property, the new building, should be about 180 feet back from the top of the bank. And it is now about 15 feet from the top of the bank, where the top of the bank is actually something they built out on the public beach. So it has two major problems. A good deal of the building, certainly all the armor stone, is on the public beach and blocking access to the public beach. And the other issue is it doesn't have a setback. The setback doesn't meet not only the 75-foot requirement stipulated in the Planning Act, but it also doesn't meet the 50-foot requirement as laid out in the buffer zone under the Watercourse and Wetlands regulation. So it doesn't meet in two ways.
Now, one explanation that was presented in regards to this project being in compliance with the Planning Act was that they established the high tide mark at the seaward end of the rock wall. And the rationale with that was that it would not erode at the same rate as the rest of the shore.
Yeah, and I mean that's an interesting argument, but it suggests that a seawall is going to be able to stop the erosion. And what's shown in all along the North Shore, and many people have tried it, including the McAndrews, you just can't stop the water from getting around behind it. And so the photos, ironically posted by the new owners, show the water behind the seawall, substantially behind the seawall. So obviously that's not where the high water line is, because it got in behind the seawall, and now the seawall is sticking out 20 or 30 feet from the natural bank.
Now, thanks to your Freedom of Information request, we were made aware of a stop work order placed on this project on September 14th of 22. There were ample reasons given for this issuance and remedies attached to it, but immediately thereafter it was decided that the project's compliance was assured and that order was lifted. Was the stop work order justified? And if so, why was it reversed?
Yeah, the stop work order was clearly justified. I mean, the department, we saw from our access to information request, department officials were shocked themselves of what was going on. So, but they hadn't really paid very much attention. And again, it's partly because there were two different departments. So the Department of Environment was looking at it from their perspective. They only had a 50-foot requirement. But they pointed out in the access to information, they pointed out in their correspondence back and forth that might not meet the requirements of the Planning Act. And so they disputed themselves whether or not this was going to be in compliance. And they had some weasel words in the issuance of the permit saying that the permit's issued, but it has to be in full compliance with the Planning Act. And it's not. So that was kind of their escape if pushed. But in fact, they realized that they should stop the work. They did take a look at all the drawings. They did some measurements. And they realized that they'd sort of fallen into a trap. They'd fallen into a couple of things. They had, first of all, decided to take the armor stone and the wall as the top of the bank, and that definition doesn't fit what is described in the regulations. So they were having trouble with that one. And also it didn't meet these requirements of 75 feet versus 50 feet. But instead of actually dealing with that and saying, well, the stop work order stays and we have to change things, and it would have been easy to change at that point because they only had footings down, they decided to stick with it. And I think there was no logical explanation for that except if you follow the correspondence the department was issuing at that time. The building contractor, who was representing the builder at that point, was arguing in very strong language that they were going to proceed. And I think the department was worried at that point that because they had already issued a development permit which was contrary to the regs, that they would have a hard time going back. And so they just caved in. They acquiesced very quickly and sent them a order saying that we rescinded the stop work order. Interestingly, a year or so later, the minister said that they'd issued a variance. But the variance is defined in regulations and in the legislation, and the variance has very clear specifications. The variance you can only vary the regulations if the zone where you're trying to issue the variance cannot comply because of some other requirements. The lot's not big enough is the most obvious one, and this lot goes back more than a kilometer to the road, so you can't make an argument that there was a variance issued because there was lots of room to move the building back. The other thing we didn't realize at the time, and it didn't become clear till later, is the department was putting pressure on them to remove some of the armor stone because it was encroaching on the neighbor's property. Well, what we didn't realize is they bought the neighbor's property through the purchase by their building contractor. They then acquired the land so that the neighbor couldn't complain. And that's the way they dealt with the large amount of armor stone that extended beyond their own property. So they were essentially after the fact acquiring property that, in the surface of it, was actually contrary to the Lands Protection Act, because they now had acquired a 47-acre parcel next to their parcel without having to go to cabinet. And we discovered later on that they, in fact, owned both parcels because they sold both of them at the same time under the same order. So, and they argued they didn't actually own it; they only held a mortgage on it, or some similar argument.
Now, as this development began taking shape, it became clear that the public had very little recourse, despite widespread opposition to it. One potential course of action remained, and that was in the form of a judicial review. You were instrumental on moving this forward. Can you share with us the effort to discern whether a judicial review was a legally sound tool and why it was never used?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of trouble getting a law firm to take a look at this in PEI, but we had lots of folks prepared to talk to us informally about the judicial review and some of the hurdles we would face. And some of those hurdles were quite large. And one of them is there's a 30-day limit to when you can file a judicial review. And the 30 days, it's a little bit unclear when the clock starts ticking. But it could be interpreted that the 30 days started when Cabinet approved the thing. Well, it was approved by Cabinet initially. The purchase was approved back in 2020. So the 30 days was long gone for that one. And then it could be argued that it was 30 days from when the permit was issued, and that was September 2021. But construction didn't start until May 2022. So again, nobody knew that, and you wouldn't know unless you were studying the permits at all times, that the thing had been approved back in 2021. So there was that 30 days. Now, a judge can decide to extend the time, and we were sort of working on that assumption, and the ground kept changing around all of this. But then the second hurdle was pointed out to us, and the second hurdle was standing. Do you have standing? And the standing means how's your ox going to be gored by this development? And we were hikers who were interested in protecting access to the public beach, but we weren't property owners on either side of the land development, and we knew that one of the land owners was in fact the purchaser because they bought the land next door. So we didn't have that standing, and we knew that the owner on the other side was a landowner in Ontario who was quite intimidated by the new owner and them threatening to. They share a driveway, and it wasn't clear whether or not that would be an easy thing to do to get access to the driveway if they started to complain. So there were major hurdles around standing that we were told we likely would not win within the Supreme Court. And the third hurdle was that the developer had boundless resources. So we were told by several of the legal people that they could bring a lot of pressure on the court, the Supreme Court, and bring a lot of lawyers in on the case. And we didn't have that kind of resources. And we discovered subsequently that some of the environmental organizations in Prince Edward Island were already being challenged by complaining about some of the IRAC decisions, and developers were threatening legal action against them. And so it didn't look like it was going to be a slam dunk by any means, and likely we would be sued, and we didn't really want to take that personal risk.
Now, this is a broad topic that has far-reaching implications. I thank Bryson for being a key reason that we were made aware of it. By the fall of 22, work at the site on 251 Kelpie Lane had come to an end. The response to this project had galvanized islanders and garnered regional and national coverage. Government was clearly trying to distance itself from it. Despite the millions already spent, it appeared as though the developers had lost their enthusiasm to complete what they'd begun. On 21st of December of 2023, the property was sold to Pan American Properties, Inc., of which Islander Tim Banks is primary shareholder and CEO. The original owners, 251 Kelpie Lane, Inc., hold a limited recourse mortgage on the original 17.7-acre parcel, as well as the adjoining 44-acre property, which, according to public records, they don't even own. Once again, IRAC and the Executive Council signed off on the transaction without explanation. The terms of this type of mortgage are noteworthy for many reasons. If the mortgagor defaults on it, then the mortgagee's only collateral is the properties themselves. They can't sue the mortgagor. This default would place 251 Kelpie Lane, Inc. as de facto owners of a tract of land that technically they never held title to. This mortgage came due in July of 2024. There was no new documentation attached to the properties at that time. There was no activity on the site. As of July of this year, there's been no change on the site or in the documentation. So, a questionable land transaction in 2020 facilitated a controversial multi-million-dollar shorefront development which ground to a halt in the fall of 23 and now sits in jurisdictional limbo. The fact that this development was allowed to even get to this stage provides clear evidence of a flawed process. At every level, absence of transparency, public oversight, and accountability were clearly on display. Policies were ignored and regulations nullified. One positive takeaway from 251 Kelpie Lane, Inc. is that public engagement can still be effective. I thank you for the time spent with us today.